Today we will continue the thematics of the sufficiently general theory of governance. Last time we looked into the structural method of governance and its implementation in the life of society. What remains to be considered is the structureless method of governance and the method of governance on the basis of virtual structures. Why is it important? Because when you only have an idea of the structural method of governance, then many really governed processes in life will be perceived by you as random convergences of circumstances that are not governed by anyone in any way. One such example is, if you turn to history, you will find the U.S. National Security Council Directive 20/1 of August the 18th, 1948, our objectives with respect to Russia, and compare it with the documents of the CPSU Central Committee, plenums and congresses of the CPSU of that era, Directive of the Central Committee of the CPSU on the construction of developed socialism, on the construction of communism in a single country, which was supposed to become the leader of the civilizational development of all humanity. They remained unfulfilled, even within the jurisdiction of our country, within the boundaries of its territory. When, in fact, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Politburo had a specific monopoly on the structural method of governance, and any decision could be lowered to the very bottom along the hierarchy of structures of governance. It was possible to request reporting information on any question from any level. And the United States of America wrote Directive 20/1, and it, over several decades, became a reality in life outside the jurisdiction of the United States and beyond the reach of structures. At least official structures on the basis of which the statehood of the United States was formed and operates. However, if you have an idea only of the structural method of governance, then such a correlation of documents, program documents of the Soviet Union and the United States, is not explainable. All that remains is the nonsense on the theme that socialism is not life-capable, and the Soviet Union collapsed somehow by itself. Well, if there is something that works outside of the structural method of governance, then how? It turns out that the abstractionism of the sufficiently general theory of governance, in the aspect of structureless governance, in the aspect of governance on the basis of virtual structures, makes it possible to explain this kind of thing and detect governance where, from the point of view of those who use only the concepts about structural governance, there is no and cannot be any governance.
В достаточно общей теории управления вводится понятие суперсистема.
The sufficiently general theory of governance introduces the concept of supersystem. A supersystem is defined as a plurality of elements, every one of which is capable of self-governance based on the information and
Наряду с
algorithmics
этим
that
каждый
are in
из
its memory.
элементов способен излучать, выдавать
Along with
информацию
this,
во внешний
every one of
мир,
the elements is capable of
из
emitting
той
information
информации,
into
которая
the external
есть в
environment
памяти.
from the information that is in
Кроме
its
того,
memory.
каждый из элементов суперсистемы способен
And,
воспринимать
in
информацию
addition,
из внешней
every one of
среды,
the elements of the
воспринимать
supersystem
алгоритмику
is
из внешней
capable of
среды,
perceiving
в
information
том числе
from the external
воспринимать
environment,
информацию
perceiving algorithmics
от
from the
других
external
элементов
environment,
суперсистемы.
including perceiving information and algorithmics
Вот если
from other elements
есть
of the
такое
supersystem.
множество элементов, то в нем возможно то, что названо бесструктурным управлением.
So, if there exists such a plurality of elements, then
Принципиальное
in it,
отличие
what is called
структурного
structureless
способа
governance is
управления
possible.
от бесструктурного управления состоит в том, что построение
The fundamental
структурного
difference between the structural
структурным
method of
способом
governance and
управления
structureless method of governance
предшествует
is that the
началу
construction of the
механического
structure in the
процесса
structural
развития.
method of governance
То есть вы
precedes the
сначала
beginning of the
должны
process of
построить
governance.
структуру,
That is to say, you
целесообразную
first
по
have to build a
отношению к
structure
определенным
that is purpose
целям.
consonant in
Только
relation to
после
certain
того, как вы
objectives,
ее построили
and
и
only after you
утвердили,
have built and
вы
arranged it,
можете начать
you can start the
управленческий
process of
процесс.
governance.
Это касается
This literally
всех
applies to all
правовых
social
норм и
applications.
положений. Если вы создаете бизнес,
If
вы не
you are
сможете
creating a
управлять
business,
этим
you cannot
бизнесом,
govern that business
если в
if
нем
in it the number of
количество
personnel
персонала
is
больше,
higher
чем
than that which
то,
allows
которое
everyone to
позволяет
communicate at
совмещаться
the pace of doing
в
business.
ведении дела. Если
If the
количество
number of
персонала
personnel is
больше,
greater,
то вы должны
then you must build
построить
an organizational staff
организационно-штатную
structure,
структуру,
fill it with
наполнить ее
personnel,
кадрами,
distribute among them
распределить
sole
среди
personal
них
responsibility,
наличную
powers,
персональную ответственность,
resources, so
полномочия
that they can
и
engage in a
ресурсы
common
для
cause.
того, чтобы они могли делать совместное дело. Только
Only
после того,
after
как
all the
разрешены
non-determinacies of this kind
такого
have been
рода,
resolved,
структура может начать работать
can the
и
structure
начнет
begin to
двигаться.
work,
При
and the
этом
work
вам,
will begin
возможно,
to be
придется
done.
что-то корректировать и в
At the same
распределении
time,
единоличной
you may have to correct
персональной
something,
ответственности и в
both in
пополнении
the
штатного
distribution of
расписания
sole personal
новым
responsibility
персоналом или
and in
уборкой
replenishing the staff
всего
schedule
лишнего
with new
персонала.
personnel,
Но пока вы не
or
сформировали
removing
структуру
from it
хотя бы в
excess,
каких-то ближайших
unnecessary
процессах,
personnel.
управление не может начаться. В бесструктурном управлении все
But
протекает
until you
иначе.
have formed a structure, at least
Вы
in the first
распространяете
approximation,
в
the process of
суперсистему
governance
некий
cannot
информационный
begin.
модуль в режиме для всех. Режим для всех
In structureless governance, things are different.
средства массовой информации.
You distribute a certain
Бывает
informational module in the supersystem
режим для
in the
всех.
mode for everyone.
Вы пускаете слух, который люди передают.
How is the mode for everyone
вероятно,
carried out in
записывается
practice?
на радио. Соответственно, с их интересами,
The mass media
соответственно, с
cover a
интересами
certain part of the
с
audience.
интересами
This is the mode for everyone.
материала. Тоже
You start a
информационный
rumor
модуль
that people spread
распространяется.
among themselves, so-called word of
Вы
mouth,
можете
corresponding
загрузить
to their
информацию в
interests
интернет
and
в
corresponding to the
режиме,
interests of their
при этом в
potential and
зависимости
real
от того,
listeners.
какие
The
настроения,
information module
какие
is also
интересы
spread.
сложились. И вот если
You can upload
распространение
information to the internet,
информационного
and
модуля
many
для
people
вас
will get to it too,
представление,
depending on what moods, what
то
interests
в
they
этом
have.
случае может возникнуть отличная от нуля
And
вероятность того,
if the spread of this
что
information
некоторое
module
количество
is predictable for you,
суперсистемы на
then
основе
in this
собственного
case, there may be a non-zero probability
но
that
под
a certain number of
воздействием
elements of the
распространения
supersystem,
этого
on the basis of their
информационного
own
модуля
self-governance, but
сами сложатся
under
в
the impact of the
структуру,
spread of this information module,
количество
will
структур
themselves
может
combine
быть
into
оказано
structures.
до многих, нескольких большого количества структур. И
The
каждый
number of
из этих
structures can be
структур
from
будет
one to
нести
many, a
алгоритм
few, or
управления,
a large number of
который
structures.
работает на достижение целей, связанных с этим информационным модулем. В этом случае
And every one of these structures will carry
цели,
algorithmics of governance
связанные с
that
этим
works towards
информационным
achieving the
модулем, будут
objectives
достигнуты.
connected with this informational
Но
module.
структуры, которые обеспечат
In this
достижение
case,
этих
the
целей,
objectives connected with
сложатся
this
в
informational
процессе
module will be achieved.
структурного управления. И только
But
после того,
the
как
structures that will ensure the achievement of these
тоже начнут
objectives
работать
will take shape in the process
в режиме
of structureless
структурного
governance,
управления, каждая на достижение этих
and
самых
only
целей.
after they take
Да,
shape
при этом они
will they
могут
also begin to work in the mode of
часть
structural
структур
governance,
может не
every one of
достичь
them
целей,
to achieve these
какая-то
very
часть
objectives.
структур достигнет целей. Но так или иначе, без
Yes,
структурного
at the same time,
управления
they can
вероятность на
compete.
статистическом
Some of the
числе,
structures may not achieve the
оно
objectives,
приведет к
some of the
достижению
structures
целей.
will achieve the objectives, but
Качество управления
one way or the other, structureless governance
может
in the
быть
probabilistic
оценки
statistical sense
качества от 0
will
до
lead to the achievement
90%.
of the objectives.
И все определяется искусством этого самого
The quality of
Discernment,
governance can vary,
его
the
организации.
evaluations of quality, from 0 to 100%.
Что здесь важно? Вот. Главное, что
And everything is determined by the art of this very structureless governance, its organization. What here is important?
наличествует в памяти, ну, по крайней
The
мере,
main thing
некоторой долей
is that structureless governance is
составе
built on the
суперсистемы.
basis of the information that is already
Если вы
present in the
хотите,
memory
чтобы были
of at least a
какие-то
certain
действия,
part of the elements in the
но
supersystem.
под эти действия нету информации и алгоритмики в
That
памяти
is,
элементов
if you want there to
составе
be some
этой
actions,
системы, то если
but
вы
there is no
сгружаете
information
информационный
and
модуль,
algorithmics for these
соответствующий
actions
этой
in the memory of
суперсистеме,
elements
то он просто не найдет
in the
выхода.
composition of the supersystem, then
Поэтому
if you load the
деструктурное
corresponding
управление
informational
в таких
module
случаях
into this
возникнет
supersystem,
сразу, если
then it simply will not
есть
find a response.
информационные модули в памяти элементов, которые
Therefore,
позволяют
in some
реализовать
cases, structureless governance is possible immediately.
Ну, а если
If there are
таких
information
модулей нет,
modules
то
in the memory of
реализация
elements that allow you to implement the corresponding algorithmics
ну, по крайней
and
мере, в 3
achieve the
этапа.
objective.
После того, как вы определились с целями, вы должны
Well,
выработать
if there are no
информационное
such
политическое
modules,
обеспечение
then the
достижения
organization of
этих целей.
structureless governance should proceed in at
После
least
того,
3
как вы
stages.
его выработали, вы должны сгрузить это информационное
After you have decided on the objectives, you must work out informational algorithmic support for
так,
achieving
чтобы
these
оно стало
objectives.
локализованным в памяти некоторого
After you have worked it
потребительского
out,
модуля.
you must load this informational algorithmic
После
support
того,
into
как
the
оно
supersystem
стало
in such a way that
достоянием
it becomes
памяти
localized in the
элементов
memory of a
суперсистемы,
subplurality of
только
the elements
после
of this
этого вы
supersystem.
можете построить и сгрузить какой-то модуль под
After it has
воздействием
become the
которого
property of the memory of the elements of the
эти
supersystem,
элементы
only after that can you build
активизируются,
and upload a module
сложат,
under
образуют
the
собой
impact of which
структуры,
these
которые
elements are
донесут,
activated,
будут
form
реализовывать
structures that will carry,
ту
will
алгоритмику,
implement that algorithmics,
информационно-алгоритмическое обеспечение
then
достижения целей,
informational
которые вы
algorithmic support
разработали на
for
первом
the
этапе,
achievement of the objectives
подобрали
that you worked out
в
at the
другом
first
месте
stage
где-то.
or picked up
После
in a
этого
ready-to-use
вы
form
внедрили
somewhere.
его.
After that,
И вот
you
если
implement it.
первые 2 этапа вы некоторым образом миновали, то вы не сможете никогда
And if you have
реализовать
somehow passed the first 2
управление.
stages, then you will never
Потому
be
что
able to organize structureless
суперсистема
governance.
не может
because the
откликнуться
supersystem cannot respond in the way you want to
желаемый
the
для
message
вас
to
образ
activate
на
actions.
посыл к активизации действий. Ну а вот теперь
Well,
давайте
now let's
посмотрим
look from the
с
standpoint of this
позиции
abstract
этого
apparatus
абстрактного аппарата на то, как
at how it was possible
можно было
to implement the
реализовать
National Security
директиву
Council
Совета
Directive
национальной
20/1
безопасности
outside the
за
jurisdiction
пределами
and beyond the power of the state structures
юрисдикции
of the
и за
USA.
пределами власти государственных структур Соединенных Штатов. Цели
The
директивы
objectives of the directive are simple:
ликвидация советской власти,
the
расчленение
elimination of
страны,
Soviet power,
ликвидация
dismemberment of the
военно-экономической
country,
мощи,
the elimination of military
создание
and
условий,
economic power,
которые
the creation of
гарантируют
conditions that
зависимость
guarantee
от
the
власти
dependence
страны
of the
от
wreckage of the country
внешнеполитических
on
сил.
external political forces.
Но это основные цели, кого интересует детальность.
These are the main objectives.
Найдите
For
директиву
anyone interested in the
в
details,
русскоязычном
please
переводе
find the
или
directive in the
на
Russian
русском
translation
тексте, она
or in the
будет
original
на
English text.
почитать.
It is on the internet. Read it.
Дальше
Then a
возникает
simple
простой
question
вопрос:
arises:
как эти цели
how can these
реализовать?
objectives be realized?
Что
What is the
является
conductor for their realization?
для продвижения?
The conductor
является
is
то,
what is
что
commonly
можно
called
называть
the cultural
культурной
environment,
обмен мнениями через культурную
the
среду,
exchange of opinions through the cultural environment,
литературу,
literature,
общение.
communication between people.
И дальше вот давайте
And then
смотреть.
let's take a look.
Что необходимо?
What is the first thing to
Посеять
do?
убежденность, ну, если не
Sow the
широких
conviction.
масс населения,
Well,
но
if not
среди
into the
населения,
broad
по
masses of the
крайней мере,
population,
той части
not into the
общества,
entire
которая
population,
черпается
then at least into that part of society from which the governorial core is drawn, from where people come to bodies of state power, to the directorates of enterprises in the economic sphere, to the system of education. Socialism is a mistake. It is not a consistent system. So please turn to history.
Ну, во-первых, действительно,
Well,
советское общество
first of all,
было
indeed,
нравственно-психологически
Soviet society was
неспособно
obviously psychologically incapable of living in accordance with the principles set forth in the USSR Constitution of 1936.
предпосылки к тому, чтобы им можно было манипулировать.
This already creates the necessary prerequisites for it to be manipulated, since it was not autocratic. In order to work out conceptual autocracy, all the more, to work it out in such a way that it would gain the support of the hierarchically highest all-encompassing governance, it was necessary to free oneself from Marxism.
Обеспечение консервации марксизма в его исторически сложившемся виде.
Therefore, one of the tasks that was being solved was to ensure the conservation of Marxism in its historically taken shape form. Moreover, preferably in the pre-Stalinist version. And this was realized because Stalin's works became inaccessible to the broad masses of people. They were removed from the curricula of all higher educational institutions, and Marxism, in the form in which it had taken shape by the beginning of 1917 or by the end of 1917, became in the USSR a dogma. But since it did not allow the solution of the tasks of the country's development in this form,
То есть
Errors of
процесс
governance
идет
accumulated
сам
and
собой.
accumulated.
Что еще
Correspondingly,
необходимо?
there were claims of the population
Необходимо
against the state. That is, the
предложить
process goes by itself.
варианты решения проблем. Причем,
What else is
понимаете, здесь
necessary?
не обязательно предлагать
It is
работоспособные
necessary
варианты,
to offer
которые
solutions to the
позволяют
problem.
решать проблемы. Требуется
Moreover,
предложить
here
варианты,
it is
которые
not obligatory to offer a functionally operable variant that really allows one to solve the problem.
прописано в директиве Совета
It is
Национальной
required to propose variants that lead to ensuring that the achievement of the objectives set out in the National Security Council Directive 20/1 is
Здесь
possible.
предлагается либерально-рыночная модель.
What is here?
Миф
It
о том,
proposes a
что
liberal market
передовые
model
государства
and the
Европы,
myth that the
Соединенные
advanced
Штаты,
states of Europe, the
Канада,
United States,
Австралия
Canada,
живут на
Australia
основе
live on the
действительно
basis of a
либерально-рыночной
truly
модели.
liberal market economy.
Кроме того, поскольку
In
СССР
addition, since the
многонациональное
USSR is a
государство,
multinational state,
то предлагается
the myth is
миф о
proposed
том,
that
что
Russia feeds the national outskirts,
Россия кормит национальные окраины, а сама
and
по себе
they are nothing by
к
themselves,
национальным окраинам
while the national
предлагается миф о
outskirts are
том,
offered the
что
myth
Россия
that Russia sucks the
прекрасно
juices out of
растет,
them,
если бы они жили
and
самостоятельно,
if they
то
lived
тогда
independently,
все было
then
иначе,
everything would be
количество
different,
местного
and the
населения,
quality of life of the local population would
несоизмеримо
increase
было бы
incommensurably in comparison to how it takes place in the USSR.
Далее миф о том, что эффективный частный собственник
Further,
как
the
управленец
myth that an effective
гораздо
private
лучше, чем
owner as a
государственный
governor
бюрократ.
is much better than a state bureaucrat.
Для того, чтобы это распространялось,
In order for this
требуется,
to
опять
spread,
же, запрет
again, a ban is required
и
and the
создание
creation of
условий,
conditions in which
в
it is
которых
impossible to work
невозможно
out an
выработать
alternative.
альтернативу. Если вы посмотрите на то,
And if
что
you look at what
происходило в
happened in the
советском
Soviet
прошлом
past from
с
1953
1953
to
года до
1985,
1985, то все, что
then
было
everything that was
направлено
aimed
на
at building Soviet power as a true
построение
democracy
советской власти
was
как
thoroughly suppressed
эффективного
by both the
apparatus
party
власти,
apparatus and the system of
оно
state
тщательно
propaganda.
подавлялось и
Well,
партийным
and in the most
аппаратом,
dangerous
и
cases,
системой
by the
государственного
KGB of the USSR,
аппарата,
and
ну а
in
в
some
итоге
cases, by the use of armed forces of the
от
USSR
таких
against
опасных
its own
случаев
people.
КГБ СССР и в ряде случаев применением вооруженных сил СССР против собственного народа.
A
Общеизвестный
well-known
факт
fact is the Novocherkassk
Новочеркасской
massacre in
расстрельной
1962.
Это все государственная политика, направленная
This is all
на
state policy aimed at suppressing attempts to
подавление
build Soviet power
попыток
as a true democracy.
построения советской власти как
But
истинной
along with
демократии.
this, all sorts of
Но
so-called
наряду
dissident
с этим
movements that
всевозможные
believed in the
так
myth that the
называемые
West was really
диссидентские
human
движения,
rights in their implementation.
которые уверовали в миф о том,
True
что
freedom,
Запад –
a
это
truly
истинные
effective
права
economy,
человека,
this was not factually
что
suppressed.
истинная свобода, действительно эффективная экономика – это
Rather, the
реально
policy in relation to
подавлялось.
this was characterized by what can be
Скорее,
rudely called
политика
to
в
piss someone
отношении
off.
этого характеризовалась тем, что
That
можно
is,
по-русски
if a
можно
person
назвать
himself
своего
adheres
рода
to some
ограничителем.
opinions,
То есть, если человек
this is
сам по
one
себе
thing. He is
придерживается
passive.
каких-то мнений, это одно,
But
он
in
пассивен.
order for
Но
him
для
to
того,
become
чтобы
active,
он активен,
he
ему
must be
надо
pissed
достать,
off,
и
and then
тогда
he will
вот эти
implement these
мнения
opinions
будет
into
продолжать
life.
действовать. И вот политика КГБ
And the
против
KGB's
диссидентов
policy
– это не
against
политика
dissidents
подавления
was
и
not a policy
уничтожения.
of suppression and annihilation.
Это политика, направленная на то,
It was a
чтобы
policy aimed
растрочить и
at pissing
создать
off
массовку.
and creating masses,
И она тоже
and it was
действительно
really carried out.
проводилась. И КГБ, ЦК КПСС
and the KGB, the Central Committee of the CPSU. In this matter, they acted as generators of processes of structuralist methods of governance towards the social system, if we consider it as a supersystem. And, in the end, by 1985, there had appeared a mood that, on the one hand, wanted socialism, but under socialism, it wanted the principles of petty bourgeois liberalism to be realized. Well, you see, one is incompatible with the other, and if the declarations of the announcements are not compatible with the defaults, and the algorithmics loaded into the supersystem is tailored for the implementation of the defaults, then these defaults are realized. That is, the organization of structuralist governance based on the fact that the cultural environment is a conductor of certain information and algorithmics outside the boundaries of its own jurisdiction is quite possible. And the example of the implementation of the directive of the United States National Security Council by the structuralist method is in this regard indicative. So, how the National Security Council Directive 20/1 was realized is impossible to understand if there is no idea of the structuralist method of governance. But there is another aspect here. A number of organizations in the USSR, including the KGB, the Central Committee of the CPSU, the Ideological Department of the Central Committee of the CPSU, creative unions of writers, artists, filmmakers, and so on, were the generators of processes of structuralist governance. But, in order for them to take shape in this capacity on their own, it took some time, and, moreover, if the process had been left to itself, then the variant that the directive of the US National Security Council would not have been implemented was not excluded, for the simple reason that an alternative conception would have appeared in the culture of the USSR. That is, Soviet power would have really become Soviet power, people's power, but not the power of bureaucrats who called themselves Soviet power. In this case, the economy of the country would have developed in a completely different way. The creative potential of people would have been realized, and would have found a place for realization, both in the economy and in the humanitarian spheres. The quality of life of Soviet society and every one of the people would have been different. And in this case, the Soviet Union would have become the only state superconcern, a superpower, to join which as a Union Republic would have been desirable for everyone else, including the United States. But these tendencies had to be blocked. And these tendencies could not be blocked, relying only on the structuralist method of governance. That is, all processes in supersystems are not described on the basis of a combination of structural and structuralist methods of governance. and even the circumstance that the structural method of governance arises from structureless governance in cases where objectives remain stable, wanted for a long time, and the structures that have arisen once in structureless governance become permanent, and then the same objectives are achieved not on the basis of structureless governance, but on the basis of systematically acting structural governance. This does not describe the entire completeness of the process. Here, another supplementary governance is required, which, in terms of the sufficiently general theory of governance, is characterized as governance on the basis of virtual structures. Governance on the basis of virtual structures, as I said in my introductory lecture, is possible in cases where you have two supersystems, and one of these supersystems is a subplurality of the other, an encompassing one. That is, every element of supersystem 2 is an element of supersystem 1. But not every element of supersystem 1 is an element of supersystem 2. And now, if you have a certain structure in supersystem 2 that is purpose consonant in relation to the achievement of certain objectives, then the structure is not visible from the position of supersystem 1. If it is visible and perceived, then the division of supersystem 1 into supersystem 1 as encompassing and nested in it supersystem 2 is destroyed. But this structure that exists in supersystem 2, it can be a part or a branch of certain structures that are present and operate outside supersystem 1, or operate from within supersystem 1, but they are certain secrets in it. That is, in it, they are also not recognizable. And so, if through the nested in the supersystem structure, a certain process of governance is implemented, then it will be seen as a kind of random convergence of actions of seemingly independent elements of supersystem 1 or supersystem 2. But, in reality, you are dealing with some structural governance. Its source can be supersystem 1, or some governance that goes beyond the boundaries of supersystem 1. And now, if we consider humanity as a whole as supersystem 1, and consider the USSR as supersystem 2, that is, all citizens of the USSR are all people, but not all people are citizens of the USSR, then the penetration of certain structures from the outside, it allows organizing also structureless governance. And such structures, penetrating from the outside, in general, can be agent networks of intelligence services of foreign states, or there can be all kinds of esoteric subcultures of their carrier. And they are necessary precisely in order to block and neutralize unacceptable tendencies in such processes of organizing structureless governance, which can destroy structureless governance organized on the principles of cultural cooperation, the spread of information, because only through them is it possible to give commands to block unacceptable tendencies. And if these structures penetrate into bodies of state power, special services, then through them it is possible to suppress unacceptable tendencies and stimulate the development of acceptable tendencies. And then it so happens that structureless governance in the wanted form is provided by governance through penetrating structures. But these penetrating structures are not perceived as structures at the level of this very nested supersystem. But governance on the basis of such structures, it can go beyond the boundaries of the encompassing supersystem. This applies first of all to almightiness. Because if you look at the almighty governance, then everywhere there is an absolute structural method of governance, because the Almighty knows what, when, why, and for what He deploys structures purpose-orientedly and in advance. Another thing is that not all of them are activated. Not all of them are governed in a directive order from above. Some of them are governed on the principles of self-governance, on the basis of the information and algorithmics that are already laid into the system. If we talk about structural, structureless, and governance on virtual structures, their combination in life, then Western Freemasonry at one time destroyed the Russian Empire. It tried to build the USSR as a legally Masonic state, and the CPSU was the largest Masonic lodge in the world. But when the Marxist project reached a dead end, the same Freemasonry organized the implementation of the NSC Directive 20/1 of August 18, 1948. But since the process was not completely controlled, projects that were unpredictable for the organizers of the collapse of the USSR also emerged. Well, one of them is the conception of social safety. CIA officers in their time were amazed at how the USSR quickly collapsed, faster than they wanted, and expressed regret that everything was accompanied by unpredictable effects, and they did not know what to do about it. Well, this is one of the indicators that the hierarchically highest, all-encompassing governance also takes place. And the projects are accompanied by unpredictable consequences and accompanying effects. The only difference is that for the projects that flow in the stream of God's allowance, such unpredictable effects and consequences devalue the project and can lead to its collapse. and for the projects that are initially oriented towards their flow in the stream of providence, the accompanying effects and final results are accompanied by some additions that improve the project, improve its result, and the quality of life turns out to be higher than it was intended. But, nevertheless, returning to the thematics of structural and structureless governance, and governance on the basis of virtual structures, these three methods of governance are the conceptual apparatus that enables you to see governance where it really is, but is not visible if a person thinks only by structural methods of governance and has no idea about structureless governance and governance on the basis of virtual structures. The combination of these three methods of governance allows you to describe and build processes of governance in supersystems without losing sight of any possibilities, and realizing all the possibilities in your projects in the most complete way. Well, if, again, returning to the historical past, then the structural and structureless methods of governance and governance on the basis of virtual structures can be implemented by different schemes of governance, program and program adaptive, and predictor corrector schemes of governance, and the intellectual scheme as the most complete expression of the predictor corrector scheme of governance. Well, that is all for today. Thank you for your attention. All the best.